right, if the children didn't get the cue, I didn't give the instruction for them to leave, but they look like they know what they're doing. This is part 2 of lesson 33, which we started last week, and we'll finish tonight looking at the last half of Genesis chapter 49, which means that next week will be our last lesson in the book of Genesis, covering the grand finale, the 50th and final chapter. But tonight we'll be looking at Genesis chapter 49, and we'll be beginning at verse 16. I do want to let you know that we had a very, very nice evening last night. I've had the privilege of meeting 2 new people that I had not met before. One who was a member of the Lord's church, and his wife who had a Buddhist background. And we got to sit down and look at the scriptures, and Wayne is the man that brought her to, and we had the visit with her, and as we looked at the gospel, Kate made her decision last night to obey the gospel. And so they'll be getting rid of the Buddha dolls throughout their house, is what I hear them saying. So interesting and refreshing. Again, tonight, chapter 49 of Genesis. In Old Testament times, they did something that they would, you might call it the blessing, which is very similar to our reading of a will when we hand out the blessings or inheritance that a family member would get when there is someone who is deceased. And in the case of the Old Testament custom, just as the father usually, or the one that's about to pass, is going to, he feels that the end is near, he will then gather his sons and daughters, but mainly sons, and give out a blessing to each of the sons. And the one that we're referring to now tonight is Jacob. We followed Joseph all the way through, but we culminate the end of Genesis with Joseph's father, Jacob, and in this case, in chapter 49, the blessing given out to the 12 sons. And when a man would give out the blessing, a great man of faith, it would actually be a way of announcing what he felt would be in store spiritually for his sons. It would be sort of announcing what the Lord had in store for the family. And in Jacob's case, he was telling most of his family that they were indeed a family with a future. And that's the title of this lesson, part 2. We covered it, part 1 last week, a family with a future. Now, some of Jacob's sons learned, however, that their past conduct had cost them the blessing, or at least a good blessing coming from the family, cost them their future inheritance. And this happens because, well, you know, we always reap what we sow. Whatever a man sows, that also he shall reap. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 7. But something else we learn about the blessing is that it gave Jacob's descendants great encouragement and even confidence in the years to come. It certainly would help them during their suffering later on when they were in Egypt before Moses delivered them out of Egyptian bondage. They would go through that period of time of darkness in their lives where they would reflect upon the fact that they were indeed a family with a future. And again, it probably helped them during their wilderness wanderings. And in this blessing, Jacob assured them that they would have a place, a future place in the promised land, and it meant a great deal to them. But in addition to each of all these things, this was, as you might say, Jacob's last will and testimony. And it was a beautiful revelation, I think, of the graciousness of God, the blessings that we have through Christ, and the fact that we can be confident ourselves as we know that we're going to have the greatest inheritance ever, eternity with God one day. But the main thing I want to see tonight is that Jacob's family was a family with a future, and we can see that that's true with families today. Last week, we covered the first 6 sons. Remember which of those 6 sons, the first 6 sons we covered last week belonged to one of his wives. Which one? Remember? Oh, okay, so everybody was paying attention. So if you look back at your outline, you'll see at the top there, look at your outline there, There's the first 6 sons. I grouped one of them together as 2 because they were considered like twins, basically, or at least grouped together. And so there was Reuben, there was Simeon and Levi, and Judah, Zebulun, and Issachar. And we'll make reference a little bit to a couple of those sons tonight, but we're going to focus on the last half of this outline here, where we'll look at the other 6 sons, which now this is like the Brady Bunch, right? Gets real confusing because the other 6 sons belong to 3 wives, not just the one like Leah. And so we have BILHAH, Zilpah, and Rachel. BILHAH and Zilpah are the handmaids of the others, but the main women are Rachel and Leah. And of course, you remember the battle that went on there between the baby-making competition that they had with each other, and how they used their handmaids as part of the baby-making competition. But anyway, let's get to BILHAH. Okay, so we looked at Leah's sons. Now we're going to talk about BILHAH's 2 sons, Zilpah's 2 sons, and Rachel's 2 sons. So let's begin with BILHAH. Now, BILHAH was Rachel's maid. You got these sons coming out through Leah, and now Rachel says, I'm not, nothing's happening here. I've got to get in the game here, so I'll get BILHAH, her handmaid. She has 2 sons, Dan and, Naphtali. Dan and Naphtali. And let's start with Dan. We're in chapter 49 now at verse 16. Chapter 49, verse 16. It says, Dan, now remember, these are the words of Jacob, and in most cases, he's pretty much speaking directly to these young men or old men, whatever they are, whatever their age is. He's speaking to them about their blessing. So in verse 16, he basically looks at Dan and says, Dan shall judge his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan shall be a serpent by the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels, so that its rider shall fall backward. And then verse 18, I've waited for your salvation, O Lord. That sounds kind of strange, huh? He's talking about Dan, and he sort of ends a little kind of what would you call that? A little ending like, salvation belongs to the Lord, or salvation is from the Lord. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. But let's talk about Dan. So Dan, the word Dan means judge or to judge. And you can see that, by the way, if you were to go back to Genesis chapter 30 and verse 6, when the sons were being named, Dan, it said, we'll call his name Dan because he is to judge, okay, a judge. And his tribe produced one of the most famous judges of all time. Want to take a big guess? Who do you think is the most famous judge? Well, at least one of the most famous ones. Samson. So Samson comes from the tribe of Dan. Samson was one of the most famous judges. You could read his story in Judges chapters 13 through 16. And the tribe of Dan, as you look at it geographically, they were given the fertile land that was bordering the Mediterranean Sea in Philistine territory. Problem was, when they took over that territory, when they had that territory, they weren't able to fully drive out the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines were always a thorn in the side of the flesh to the Israelites, and the tribe of Dan was never able to drive out the Philistines. So that they then could gain more land, the tribe of Dan, you'll read in Judges chapter 18, they moved north of that area. They conquered the people of LEAH, and they took their land. Now, look at verse 17 for just a minute here of chapter 49. In verse 17, Jacob associates Dan with a serpent. Okay, so let's think about that. A serpent. What are the qualities of a serpent? They're smart, you said? Oh, sharp, okay. Yeah. Deadly, crafty, cunning, swift, venomous. Okay, these are poison. There you go. So, This, to me, when he talks about, he likens or associates Dan with a serpent here, points to their crafty nature and their ability to make sudden attacks on people. Okay, and this is what you see when you follow the story of those people from the tribe of Dan. Their conquest of the people of LEAH, that I already referred to, which is talked about in Judges chapter 18. Their conquest of the people of LEAH is an example of their subtle tactics and the fact that they set up an image to celebrate this, however, shows that they weren't fully devoted to the Lord. So they came in like a serpent, they struck, and yet, like serpents are, they sort of deceive. You know, the devil's a deceiver, right? He's a serpent in the Garden of Eden. Well, they were deceived, and they set up an image, really an idol, when they conquered, and again, showed they're not totally devoted to the Lord. They even practiced idolatry on another occasion 200 years after that, when King Jeroboam set up a golden calf in Dan, and that's talked about in 1 Kings chapter 12. Again, I'm just kind of giving bits and pieces of the people of Dan. So they were, they had a little problem with idolatry there. And like all the other tribes, they certainly made their mistakes, but look again at verses 17 and 18. Look at the overall tone. Jacob alludes to their crafty ways in this analogy of a serpent, and he prays for the Lord's salvation, whether it's just for them or for everybody, but guess what? Never brings up the problem of their occasional idolatry. Jacob says nothing about that. They're basically known for their ability to judge and their snake-like ways. The focus, as with most of Jacob's sons, is that these sons represent a family with a future. That's the overriding thing. And we're seeing bits and pieces of, we saw earlier with the first three sons, Reuben, and I forget the other ones. The first three, it's on your outline there. Reuben and Simeon and Levi, not so well with those sons, but everything else, the general tone is that this is a family with a future. And so Dan's future, look at this, certainly included what? The salvation of the Lord. You see that in verse 18. So it's kind of put in the context of Dan, but it's really kind of overall as well. This is all about the salvation of the Lord. This is about a good inheritance, a family with a future. Now, let's go to verse 21. We're going to skip verses 19 and 20, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Those verses 19 and 20 give us the sons of Zilpah, and we want to skip that because we want to stay with the sons of, what am I looking at here? BILHAH, right? Yeah. And the next one is Naphtali. So go with me down to verse 21. We have Naphtali. In verse 21, Naphtali is a deer let loose. He uses beautiful words. Now, I don't know. That's very short. But I guess Naphtali could be pretty happy because he's saying, well, at least nothing was bad said. It might be real short, right? Only one verse, 2 lines basically. And for some reason, Jacob blessed Gad and Asher, the sons of Zilpah, before he spoke to this son here, BILHAH's son, Naphtali. Naphtali was located geographically north of Zebulun and Issachar, and it contained, really kind of encompassed the Sea of Galilee, okay, up in the north in Galilee. Encompassed the Sea of Galilee. And the tribe of Naphtali was distinguished for its bravery in battle, and you can read about that in Judges chapter 5 and verse 18. They also seem to have a pretty good head on their shoulders, because what does he say in verse 21? He said he uses beautiful words. Beautiful words. Now, the old King James has an odd word. It uses the word goodly. Goodly or beautiful words. And so this is something that characterized Naphtali. Now, in addition to that, Jacob said that Naphtali was a deer let loose. So let's kind of combine that. A deer let loose, and yet they had good words. You'd think a deer let loose would kind of show you the idea of something that's kind of sporadic or random in the wild, but yet there's good words. So I look at the deer let loose as kind of a description that lets you know that they were a spirited tribe. They had lots of spunk. They were ready to go, ready to run. A deer let loose, free-spirited people, not bound by tradition. And I don't take this as if they were wild or out of control. It just doesn't fit with the having beautiful words. And in fact, if you want to write this down and look it up later on, in Deuteronomy chapter 33 and verse 23, Moses even said that Naphtali was satisfied, this is the quote, satisfied with favor and full of the blessing of the Lord. So this again reminds us that what? Jacob's family was a family with a future. That's what we're seeing. The tribe of Dan was set to judge the people and receive salvation, but Naphtali was a free spirit with beautiful words and full of the blessing of the Lord. Okay, so now we're ready to move on, and we've got to go back in the story because chronologically we skipped over verses 19 and 20. Now we're going to go back to the sons of Zilpah. Now, who is Zilpah? Remember? BILHAH is Rachel's handmaid. Zilpah is who? Leah's handmaid, okay? Leah's maid, given to Jacob to bear more children after Leah. Leah's pretty greedy, man. She's got already 6 sons, and Rachel's not having any babies. Rachel can't get any, so she's got to use her handmaid to get 2. And Leah says, you know what? I'm going to up the ante a little bit. I'm going to get 2 more, and I'm not having any right now at least, so I'll get my handmaid. We'll get into this competition here. So after Zilpah had Gad and Asher, Leah did give birth to 3 more children that are not in this. It would be, 2 of them are, Issachar and Zebulun, which we covered last time, okay? And, let's see if Jim's always on his game here. So, Jim, there was one other child that they had, and it wasn't a boy. Dinah, okay? That's what by BILHAH, okay? Or, I'm sorry, Zilpah. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That was by Leah. Leah had Dinah. All right, anyway, let's look at these 2 sons born to Zilpah. The first one is Gad. The name Gad can either mean, it has a dual meaning, and it's probably a combination of both. The word Gad can either mean good fortune or troop. Some would say double troop, good fortune or good fortune maybe in a troop, whatever the case may be. But it's interesting that because of the tribe's location on the east side of the Jordan, the enemy troops could actually, from that location, easily invade them. So, when it says good troop, it almost seems like a contradiction. Wait a minute, they're in a bad spot. But guess what? You can see how that blends together. They're a good troop in a bad spot, which is a good thing because guess what? If you're a weak or bad troop in a bad spot, you got problems. So if there's going to be a weak spot, what do you want to do? You want to put a good troop there. That makes sense? Did I confuse anybody yet? You got a bad spot? Put a good troop there. They're in a place where they could get invaded easily, but they're a good troop. That's what Gad means. And so, anyway, Jacob assures the people. Well, I didn't read the verse. Let's read the 2 verses. This is chapter 49, verse 19. Gad, a troop, shall tramp upon him, but he shall triumph at last. So, in other words, they're in a bad spot. They're going to get attacked, but they will triumph, right? And then verse 20, bread from Asher shall be rich, and, it's okay, I want to get that. That's Asher. We'll just stop right here in verse 19. Okay, so a troop, I like the T's here, a troop that's going to triumph, right? That's what he says. And this is in keeping with the fact that Gad can also mean what? Good fortune. Of course, we're not talking about good luck, but when we talk about good fortune, we're talking about the fortune of God. You know what I mean? Fortune, that's an interesting word. You ever open up a fortune cookie at a Chinese restaurant? I like the one, there was this one that said, when you open up the fortunate cookie, it says, God's got your future, I'm just a cookie. That's pretty good. Good fortune comes from God, not from a cookie, right? Yeah. So we got good fortune. Good luck is not really what it's about. It's the providence of God, the blessings that God had for them. Now, again, if you're writing down scripture references, you can look this up later on. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 20. Deuteronomy 33, verse 20, Moses said there that God had made them a brave lion that could tear apart the enemy by their limbs. So this is a good troop with good fortune, good providence, in a bad place, but set to what? Triumph. And the Gadites were said to be great warriors over in Joshua chapter 22, verses 1 through 6. They were said to be great warriors. All right, now we are on to verse 20, and we're on to the son Asher, verse 20. Verse 20, bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties. Anybody else here tonight have a different word than dainties? What does the NIV say? This is the New King James, says dainties. Delicacies, sweets, bakery items, dainties, okay? So let's pick this up. So the name, okay, what does the name Asher mean? The name Asher means blessed. That's what Asher means. And Joshua chapter 19 tells us that they settled down. I'm talking about geography here. Joshua 19 tells us they settled down to be an agricultural people, taking advantage of the fertile land that God gave them. And so Jacob's blessing, that's what Asher means, his blessing upon them was that the bread from Asher will be what? What does it say there? Rich. Lots of bread. They would make royal dainties, which is to say, they would make candies and sweets that were fit for a king. And Moses would later on, here's another reference for you in Deuteronomy chapter 33, Deuteronomy 33:24, Moses would say that Asher was the most blessed because of the security of their cities. They were very secure. And so what a great future they had, along with all the other, most of Jacob's sons. But now we get to, guess what? The very last wife and the very last two children, who's the wife? Who's the favored wife? Rachel. Two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Now, Jacob didn't hesitate to make it known that Rachel was his favorite wife and that her two sons were his favorite children. And boy, oh boy, I hope you got the message clear through all of that favoritism in the family is a horrible thing. And yet, even though it's a bad thing to show favoritism, God showed how he could work through and around that favoritism to accomplish his will anyway. So that's the beauty behind that message. He overruled their favoritism and made it work. Now, we're going to see here that Jacob said more about Joseph than any of the other sons. Look at the text here, chapter 49, verses 22 through 26. We read about Joseph. He didn't have much to say about Benjamin. Watch this on Joseph. Verse 22. So Joseph is a fruitful bow by a well. His branches rule over the wall. The archers have bitterly grieved him, shot at him, and hated him. Think about what's that talking about there? Archers shooting at him? It's his own brothers, right? Yeah, they made life difficult for him. Look at verse 24. But his bow remained in strength, and the arms of his hands were made strong by the hands of the mighty God of Jacob. For there is the shepherd, the stone of Israel. Verse 22, this is what Jacob is saying. Verse 25, 25, by the God of your father who will help you, and by the Almighty who will bless you with blessings of heaven above, blessings of the deep that lies beneath, blessings of the breast of the womb. The blessing, verse 26, the blessings of your father have excelled the blessings of my ancestors up to the most utmost bound of the everlasting hills. They shall be on the head of Joseph and on the crown of the head of him who is separate from his, what? Separate from his brothers. Now, if you were there and you were watching the giving out of the blessing, which son would you want to be? Yeah, this guy. I mean, imagine Joseph standing there and the other brothers. Maybe this, again, is kind of testing their jealousy. Or will they, instead of being jealous of Joseph again, be happy for him because of the way things turned out? I think there was a sense of happiness in their hearts that Jacob gave Joseph this blessing. That's just my guess. But anyway, let's go back to verse 22. So Joseph is compared to a fruitful vine growing over a wall. This reminds us that Joseph did not grow in his original environment, but he grew as a vine over the wall, which was where? Egypt. You see that? There's the symbolism. He's still going to prosper. He's still going to be fruitful. He could have been, if it was not God's plan, he could have been fruitful where he was. But he's going to be fruitful. He's going to be a great vine. He's just going to have to go over the wall. Yeah, Egypt. The archers, well, we already talked about that. The archers that Jacob mentions describe the suffering that Joseph experienced at the hands of his brothers and his master in Egypt. Remember, Potiphar threw him into jail and all those. These are the archers shooting at this great vine over the wall. And they tried to take his vine down as it grew on the wall. They grieved Joseph. They shot at him. They hated him. But Joseph remained, look at verse 23 and 24, he remained strong by what? The power of God. And Jacob uses three special names for God in verse 24. He calls him the Mighty One, the Shepherd, and the Rock. And it makes me think of this saying, if you hit rock bottom, remember that God is the rock at the bottom. He is our rock. He is our strength. What a wonderful promise Jacob gives Joseph. Look at verses 25 and 26. He uses the word blessing 6 times, and he covers several resources from which God extends his blessings. He mentions soil and rains and streams beneath the earth. He talks about the woman's womb, about a father's wealth, and about the blessings of your ancestors. Of all the sons, Joseph was the one who epitomized the fact that Jacob's family was a family with a future. But we're not done. One more son, the youngest, Benjamin. Look at verse 27. Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he shall devour the prey, and at night he shall divide the spoil. Well, you would expect Jacob to say quite a bit about his other favored son, but his words, in my estimation, are few and puzzling. Not much said, and even what little is said leaves me kind of scratching my head, but I'll take my best shot at it right now. He calls Benjamin a ravenous wolf. So the men of Benjamin, if you run this reference, if you looked up Judges chapter 5 and verse 14, we would find out that the men of Benjamin were brave, and at one point they helped defeat an enemy king named Sisera. That's in Judges 5:14. But when you read about Benjamin's tribal history in Judges chapters 19 and 20, you see the ravenous wolf in action. He is deadly. He is potent. He is powerful as a ravenous wolf. And by the way, did you know that Israel's first king, who was Saul, was from the tribe of Benjamin? Interesting. Saul, during Saul's career, he tried to kill David more than once. He was a ravenous wolf. He ruthlessly murdered people right and left. Yeah, King Saul was a ravenous wolf. And other Benjamites known for their ravenous nature were Abner and Sheba, and one who opposed David. Remember, a guy named Shimei, who hurled insults at David as well. Yes, all from the tribe of Benjamin. But here's another interesting character in the Bible, not in the Old Testament, who came from the tribe of Benjamin, Saul of Tarsus. That's interesting. Saul of Tarsus was a Benjamite. You know, Saul who became Paul. And so Jacob got it right in calling Benjamin a ravenous wolf. Remember, because what was Saul doing as a ravenous wolf? He was going after and killing and persecuting Christians in the church, throwing them in jail, all that stuff. Remember? Ravenous wolf. Moses, however, called Benjamin, this is in Deuteronomy 33. I gave you lots of references in Deuteronomy 33. In verse 12, Deuteronomy 33:12, Moses called Benjamin beloved of the Lord. And so remember how God took Saul of Tarsus and turned him around. My grace is sufficient for you. And it's interesting to notice that when God's kingdom was divided after Saul's death, the tribe of Benjamin remained faithful to the messianic line with David and Judah, bringing us the Savior, Jesus, into the world. This again brings us to the reality that Jacob's sons were indeed a family with a future. So we'll close with that tonight. I'm going to say a couple more things before we say goodbye to our video audience. The statements that Jacob made in blessings and blessing his sons would be remembered by them and would be repeated by the members of his family, certainly for years and years to come. And as time would pass, they would see new and deeper meanings in these pronouncements, and they would treasure these assurances that Jacob gave them from the Lord. And while they suffered in Egypt, while they wandered in the wilderness, as I mentioned before, they would remember that they were indeed a family with a future. Jacob was sure to leave them with this legacy as we begin to close out the book of Genesis. And the parallel for us today is that we have a rich future with Jesus Christ. Our future is solid eternity with God in heaven. And with that, we'll say good night to our video audience.
Hey there, YouTube viewer. We want to thank you so much for checking out our video today, and we hope it was a blessing to you. Now that we've reached the end of our video, we're going to ask you to do two things. The first one is subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit that notification bell so you'll be alerted of any YouTube video content that we put on in the future. The second one, we want to invite you to come and worship with us in person. Every single Sunday morning at 9 a.m., we have class time for all ages, and then that's followed up by our 10 a.m. worship time as well. During the middle of the week, Wednesday night at 7 p.m., again, we have classes for all ages. We want to invite you to any and all of that. I think that you'll be really blessed by it. We can't wait to see you there.